Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to another episode of On the Couch with Creatives. I say good morning because I'm here in the UK, but good afternoon or good evening if you're anywhere else in the world. I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Julie Hyde-Mew.
And this is On the Couch with Creatives. Fans and followers of the show will know by now that we're part of the Creatives Group, the private network for creative professionals everywhere. Together, we help you to connect with like-minded individuals, create at your best, and therefore help you to grow and develop your creative business. That sounds like a good idea to you? Please don't hesitate to reach out to us after the show. We'd love to talk to you. But this, as I say, is On the Couch with Creatives. So, Julie, who do we have on the couch today?
Well, today we are talking to ghostwriter Christopher Lomas, and he's written over 40 biographies and memoirs. Just to give you an idea of the caliber of work that he does, he was the ghostwriter of the Amazon top 10 memoir, Love Interrupted by Simon Thomas. But Christopher helps anyone to tell their story and has also ghostwritten many self-published books. Let's get him on the couch so we can hear more about what he does. Hello, Chris. Welcome to On the Couch with Creatives. Lovely to see you.
Hi, Julie. Hi, Melanie. Nice to see you both. Thanks for having me here.
Well, it's an absolute honor. You've worked on so many interesting books, and we want to know all about those. But could we start off with how on earth did you become a ghostwriter? How did it all start?
Yes. Well, it started in the drains for me, actually. When I left university, I got a job on a trade magazine about drainage and wastewater. It was called Drain Trader, and it was featured on, I think, the very first series of Have I Got News for You here in the UK. And I used to write company profiles and do lots of interviews and product reviews and things like that. And through the course of doing lots of company profiles and meeting business owners and talking to people about their companies and their customers, I started to get a feel for developing stories, finding the human interest in some of the stories I was writing about. And so I did this job for a while and then went freelance as a copywriter. And I spent a lot of time writing company profiles and features and advertorials. And sometimes people would ask me to write speeches for them, and I would be asked to edit material which they'd worked on as well. So I was building up a nice portfolio of bits of writing covering lots of different areas and different kinds of writing for different audiences. And the longer I went on, the more work I did in different industries and across different sectors. So I had a nice sort of broad grasp of things, and I loved writing about anything at all. It was just a thrill, even to be writing about sewage and wastewater. To know that I could make my living by writing whatever it was about was great by me. So I loved doing all of that. And increasingly, the writing expanded. So I did a lot more speeches, keynote presentations, and then that moved into white papers and all sorts of long form writing. And then a colleague of mine suggested that I might be able to help one of his friends who was trying to write a book. So they sent me the material they'd worked on, and I edited it, and I wrote a lot of it for them as well. And it all started there, really. And I then developed quite a big portfolio of freelance work. And then I spent a bit of time at a publishing house before returning to freelance work as a ghostwriter about 5 years ago. So that's the sort of potted version.
I'm fascinated with this. I'm fascinated because think of ghostwriters. I tend to think ghostwriters more of writing sort of novels or books for other people. And hearing you talk, I can absolutely understand somebody wanting to get somebody else to write their corporate blurb, their various other bits and bobs, or technical bits and bobs, or speeches or stuff like that. But when it comes to books, I've always wondered how a ghostwriter feels about creating a wonderful book, literary work with somebody else's name on. I can't get my head around that. I struggle with it. I'm thinking, why would you do that? It's a lovely thing to do, but it was like, why would you do that?
Well, it's It's a lot of fun is one very simple reason, and quite a privilege as well, because people really entrust you with their whole lives. So once they enlist you to write their story for them, you develop a rapport and a relationship, and they will start to trust you with absolutely everything that's happened in their lives, and give you license to turn all of that into a book, into a memoir or an autobiography, which is hopefully meaningful and powerful and passionate and conveys who they are. So having the opportunity to do that for people is a really wonderful thing to do. And it is a great privilege. And I'm very pleased to have been able to work with people across so many walks of life with so many different kinds of stories to tell. And to have had that trust and that license to tell those people's stories for them. So even though my name isn't on the cover, it might be there somewhere inside, or with a thanks or an acknowledgement. I'm perfectly happy to be somewhere in the background, as all good ghosts should be.
Ah.
Well, you obviously don't have a celebrity ego on you, because obviously you do most of the work, but you're not taking the credit.
Yes, yes. I suppose it's the perfect gig for any shrinking violet or any introvert who's quite happy to sort of be in the background and do the work. And the work it's a bit of a cliche, but the work is its own reward. Being able to find the right ways to tell stories, and some of those stories can be quite complicated, and some of them can be quite difficult. But finding ways to do that which makes the named author proud and happy, and that their family and friends and potentially the wider public recognize as being authentic to that person, that's such a satisfying thing to do. So when it goes well, which it does most of the time, fortunately, then that's a great thrill in itself. I mean, maybe one day I'll write my own book with my name on it, but not yet.
I was going to ask you, have you never been tempted to write? You're not old enough to write your own memoirs and things yet, are you? You've got a good few years before you can make that decision.
Yeah, it would be ironic, wouldn't it, if I wrote all these books for other people and never wrote one for myself. It's in the back of my mind. I'm sure I could write an interesting book. It has been done. And another couple of ghostwriters have written books about their experiences as a ghostwriter. And obviously, lots of interesting things have happened, and I've met some very colourful characters along the way. So there's plenty of material there for a book, and just my own life story. I know a lot of the people that I work with are writing stories for their family, for their children. Sometimes they're writing for children they haven't met, haven't been born yet. They're not even a twinkle in the eye yet, but they know that at some point down the line they won't be around, and their grandchildren or great grandchildren might have questions about them. So I can see myself writing a book for those people yet to be born, perhaps, maybe charting all of my embarrassing moments, my many mistakes along the way.
So you must have met quite a number of well-known names in your career.
Yeah, there've been a few. Of course, one of the other difficulties of being a ghost is that you often have to sign waivers and non-disclosure agreements, depending on who you're working with, because obviously not everyone wants it publicly known that they had any assistance writing their book. Although I think that's changing. I think there is a move now to acknowledging ghostwriters as a viable and legitimate practitioner that helps people tell their stories. So I have met a few, and I've met some very good ghostwriters along the way who are quite well known as well. And it's an interesting occupation in that you really do get to meet some very famous people, and you get to meet lots of everyday people as well. I use that term loosely, and it's a nice mix. I derive just as much, if not more, enjoyment from working with everyday folks like myself who have interesting stories to tell, who want to preserve a legacy for whomever it may be. Or often I'm working with people who have survivor stories to tell, people that have been through some traumatic event or have suffered with health issues or mental health issues, and helping them to tell their stories, with the intention often of helping their readers learn from the paths that they've been on and the progress that they've made. So rich or poor, famous or not, all the stories are so fascinating. So it's nice to have that mix, really.
Yeah, they are. I worked, and I do have another branch to my business as a videographer called My Childhood Film, which is a similar thing of interviewing older people before they depart this mortal coil, and putting together imagery and photographs from and getting their stories in an interview type format. Because okay, when you're young, you go, oh, that's boring, but as you get older and you have children of your own, your history becomes really, really important. And there are so many people who I've spoken to in the past, oh, I wish I'd listened. I wish I'd listened when my mother, grandmother, aunt, uncle wanted to tell that story. Because if these stories aren't captured either, on film or in a book, once that person dies, it's gone. You can't get it back.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Yeah, I was working with somebody. Sorry, go on.
But there's no worse thing to when it has gone. Think, I wish I'd listened.
Yeah, it's one of those horrible things, isn't it? When you go to a funeral, you learn so much about people you thought you knew, and it's a similar sort of thing. And you think at that point with great regret, why didn't I know this? Why didn't I hear these stories before? And I've been working with a lady recently, and she had this great sense of trepidation that although she wanted to tell her story and preserve it, the big question was, well, I'm no one special, who is going to read it? And I think the answer in a lot of cases is that there is a lot of social history in these stories as well, because her story charts her experiences growing up in Nottinghamshire, where I live, in the 40s and 50s. And there'll be a lot of people of that who grew up in that generation who will really relate to some of those events. They will understand some of the things she's talking about, the way of life which we don't have now. And for people looking back at that from this generation, some of the things she talks about seem almost alien in comparison to the way we live now. So there's that element as well of preserving a way of life which just doesn't exist anymore, which is quite interesting also.
Yeah. The fascinating thing is that when my mother was telling me stories about her childhood, she would talk about the lab at the bottom of the garden. I go, what? You didn't have flushing toilets? And she was not from a poor family by any means, but they didn't have inside toilets. And that is almost inconceivable to people nowadays.
Yes, no, I've spoken to lots of people, and the inside and the outside toilet, moving to a house with an inside toilet is a big sort of red letter day, and it often crops up in people's stories. But all sorts of things, doing the washing in the house and hanging it over the fire, and putting hot bricks in the bed, all of those sort of slightly bygone era things, which would be lost if we didn't preserve them this way. And there's so many little sort of local quirks as well, which I think are fascinating, and little turns of phrase and idioms which we don't necessarily have anymore. So they are still being preserved and protected through the medium of these books, which is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's a really important one in terms of language, because language is changing really, really quickly. And there are some wonderful words that have been lost that we don't use. One of them cropped up on social media with another one of our creative members, and it was a wonder. I can't remember the word now because of menopause brain, but it's a wonder. I haven't heard that word for ages. Oh my goodness. And I just think that going forward, all of this rich history, and my son gets absolutely, like, he cannot get his head around that I lived in a world before YouTube or the internet or phone, like mobile phones, and the phones. I was trying to explain to him, phones, when I first had my mobile phone, I think when I first had my first mobile phone, I was in my 20s. I was certainly at work, and it just phoned people, it phoned me. And he's like, what? And I said, I think, I said, your generation is going to be incredibly boring, James. I said, because all you're going to do is just sit around and discuss what you've watched on YouTube. I said, that's going to be the sum total of your life, period.
That's true. And also, it's funny because some of this technology really kills drama, though. I've written so many scenes in books which came about purely because people didn't have any means of easily contacting somebody to tell them the dire situation they were in. So they either had to, fend for themselves and work it out for themselves, or wait for help to randomly arrive. But there was no sort of getting someone on the mobile and getting them to come and help you. So
Yeah.
yeah, all of these things which are the absolute death of drama, I think. But people, yes, it's so strange. We've moved on so much, and when you're speaking to people who are still very much alive and well and living in the same world, and you realize there's such a disparity between their experiences and yours growing up, and certainly my children growing up, their experience be so almost diametrically opposed to them, and it makes a fascinating contrast.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of your books. Could you name them and show them and tell us about them, the books that you've worked on?
Yeah. There are some which I'm not able to mention for various reasons, but no, there are lots that I'm happy to talk about. Um, and one which people may be familiar with the named author is a book I worked on when I was working at Trigger Publishing, and I'm acknowledging that they hold the rights to this book. I think it's now with Welbeck Publishing, and that's a book I did with Simon Thomas, who used to front Blue Peter and then Sky Sports football coverage. He famously lost his wife to acute myeloid leukemia at a very early age. And he wrote a book which talks about his experiences of not only dealing with her loss, but also striving to bring up his young child on his own. And that's a fascinating book and a very brave and bold book. It's quite raw in places, as you might expect, but it's a very important book, as some of these books are, because it goes into territory which perhaps aren't always delved into in other books. His experiences are written down as he felt them. He's uncompromising in terms of the extremes of grief that he experienced. So that's a really interesting book, and I worked on that one in the guise of editor contributor. So that's not one which, strictly speaking, I wrote for him, but I collaborated with him on that book. Another book that I'm very proud of is a book I wrote for a lady called Serena. I worked on that a couple of years ago. Serena's experience was a fascinating one. She was a Black child who was brought up by white foster parents in the 50s. And she articulates some of the great difficulties she had growing up, not quite feeling as if she was a part of that family unit, and the racism that she experienced. And sadly, that's also a story about the abuse that she suffered in that foster relationship with her foster father. But the book is nevertheless a very bold and ultimately a very courageous book. It's one which Serena is clearly the winner. She writes in such a winning, positive way. It's shot through with her humor, sometimes black humor, and Serena really shows how if you have the mental fortitude and you have the right people in place to help you, you can overcome so many things as she did. And one of the great sadnesses, and again, this goes back to what we were saying earlier in terms of the need and the necessity really to write your story before it's lost. So while we were working on the books, Serena was sadly diagnosed with cancer. And she actually died before the book was finished. We had got to the point where we were pretty much just proofreading and everything was almost finished. And I spoke to her very shortly before she died, and the one, well, I won't say the one thing, but one big thing that was keeping her going was the thought that her book would survive her. She knew that her story would be out there. People could read it and think of her and remember her, and hopefully to learn from it as well. So that's a great story. That's called Up to Me. I'm very proud of that one. I've worked on a number of books recently with people who have had head injuries as well, actually. I worked on one not so long ago by a gentleman who was a triathlete, he worked as a doctor, but he did various triathlete competitions in his spare time. And he was knocked off his bike in the pursuit of a triathlon, actually, and suffered severe mental difficulties as a result of the fall, as well as physical difficulties. And his book is assembled really from some of the blogs which he wrote, charting his recovery. So he had tens and tens and thousands of words of blog material, which I went through and I refined it and I sifted through it and I edited it and we reformatted it and we turned that into a very interesting book. And again, that's a book with a very important purpose for people who may have experienced something along those lines or have family or friends who may have experienced something similar. Again, it's got a very important purpose in terms of showing people that there is a path through recovery, no matter how difficult that might be. And that there is some sort of light at the end of the tunnel and a life worth living beyond the initial experience and the trauma that he went through. So that's another one that's, I think, quite important. Gosh, I've worked on a book with a hostage negotiator, and I've worked on a book with a gentleman who is charged with the responsibility of freeing people who have been removed from their family unit by an estranged husband or wife. So he had a very exciting story of his journey to Japan, where he was enlisted to retrieve a child that had been effectively stolen by the other parents. And it reads like the most extreme fiction, but it's all true. So that's an interesting one. There have been so many, and I'm working on another interesting one at the moment with a chap who spent many years of his life on drugs and in jail, and we're still at the interview stage on that one. There are so many interesting stories about how he has been trying to turn his life around and the many colourful characters that he's met along the way. So that's one that's in progress at the moment. So I think in all I've worked on 40 plus books now, so probably too many to mention, but all sorts of very interesting titles for a wide range of people. Yeah, it's been very entertaining.
It sounds it, and I'm a very emotional person. I emote and I'm very empathetic, and that's why I do have to be very careful with what I consume, because it stays with me and I'll cry buckets over a book or over a film. And my husband, who is a lot more stable, shall we say, than I am, emotionally stable, and I can be crying buckets on, especially things that involve children or animals, or as a mother, you know, I saw the program called The Killing, with what's his Nesbitt, James Nesbitt in, and I was in pieces. It took me months to get over that little boy died, and the end of it was just so awful because it was so kind of ordinary, and I was just in floods of tears. And my husband, whenever I get like this, look, Melanie, it's just a story. I said, it's not though, because stuff like this happens all the time, you know, and it doesn't. Like you say, you read these things that are actually real life, and you wouldn't fathom that these sorts of things, awful things, go on. And you know, I can't. That's why the RSPCA adverts come out. I couldn't work for the RSPCA because I would be in tears all the time and then going out killing people, because I'd be like, how could you do that to your dog? You know, I couldn't cope with it. How do you cope with it?
How do you cope with those emotions then, Christopher? Or are you more or less empathetic?
Well, I think the truth is that my skin has probably hardened the longer I've done it, which is not to say that I'm unsympathetic now, but I think when I started, I suppose a good example is that I worked on a book about postpartum disorder and some of the issues around that, and some of the people were talking about the difficulties that they had after the birth of their children, and I remember feeling the weight of their experiences. And then there was a book about somebody who was experiencing eating disorders and having strange cravings. And as I was writing that, I was thinking, oh yeah, I was having a few cravings myself for some unusual things. So I think it was affecting me very directly at that point. So it was It's quite difficult. I think the thing that gets you through it is that you're working with people who have survived, and you're working on the hopeful assumption that what you're writing will help other people in whatever difficult situation they might find themselves in. But obviously, not all of the books that I write are about people in extremis or dealing with difficult things, but some of them are. And you're buoyed, I suppose, by the state of mind of the named author. So I mean, with Serena's book that I mentioned earlier, for example, even though she's been through some dreadful experiences, and it's taken her decades really to get over some of these things and to deal with them, she was very stoical, and she was a very practical, down-to-earth person with a great sense of humor. So you pick up on those things perhaps more than the events that you're describing when you're writing about them, and you're very much focusing on the fact that you're working with a survivor. And I suppose you could say that to get too upset about some of the things you're writing about would feel almost like an indulgence, really, because we are not, I suppose that's the difference, isn't it? A lot of people tell misery memoirs, and we're not reveling in any of those things. I mean, although I've written a lot of difficult books about what you might call dark subjects, there's never any sort of salaciousness or sensationalism in describing those things. So we're sort of describing what happened in the most easily interpretable way possible without being too explicit, and then we're moving into the important thing, which is how that person survived. So I suppose that does help me to deal with it. But there are certainly moments when some of these things strike a chord. But I'm sure having worked on these books for so long, I'm slightly better at dealing with it now. I do have a wobble every now and then.
Yeah, well, I can imagine.
It's cathartic for them, isn't it? Oh, sorry, Melanie. It's
But
cathartic for them, isn't it? We're talking over each other. Sorry, you go first.
No, I'll be quiet.
Well, when people get to the point where they want to write a book or they want to tell a ghostwriter their story, they're already on the road to recovery, and they are already recovering because it's quite cathartic. And the fact that they've reached that point means that they have got that survivor streak in them by that point.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, some people, you can tell that actually, because some people get in touch and say, I'm thinking of writing a book. I've been through some difficult experiences. And when you start to talk about it, it's clear that they're not quite ready. So the ones who are ready to commit have certainly turned a corner. They are at that point in their recovery process where they've got the fortitude and the reserves of strength and possibly the support network. And they are able to deal with it, because I have to be quite stringent in making sure that the people are able to tell their stories truthfully, because that's the big thing. You can skirt around some issues without really talking about them, going into them. But my job as a ghostwriter, sometimes difficult as it will be to make sure I understand what happened and how it happened and why it happened and what the repercussions were. So all of that means it can be quite a difficult process for people who are talking about difficult events, because I will need to interrogate them about those events in the most sensitive possible way, certainly. So when they're ready to do that and they're able to have those conversations, then yes, you know they are ready. And telling the story is, for many people, it is almost drawing a line under that part of their life. A lot of people do choose to write a book because it's almost like saying that's the end of that phase of my existence. I'm putting it out there. This is my truth. This is my experience, and now I'm moving on with the rest of my life. So it does help with that.
You may now talk, Melanie.
Thank you. No, I just find it really, really fascinating. So you must have had some very, really interesting subjects, as the people that have overcome some fantastic things and have got their stories out there, or adversity, or people like you mentioned, the chap who tries to get kidnapped children back. That's essentially what they are. Even though they've been kidnapped by their parents, it's still kidnapped when a child has been removed from the country, and the devastation that causes to the mother or the father left behind. And it must be really interesting to interview those people and talk to them about how they go about their business, or you say that somebody who's trying to broker peace in a hostage situation or a war zone or whatever, and trying to get that, how those people go about their businesses and how they kind of cope with what they have to go through. I mean, it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah, it is, and I sort of dip into lots of different people's lives and sort of, without being too fanciful, almost inhabit some of what they're going through a little bit as well. So you do feel as if you develop a connection with that person, and you start to understand a little bit about how they do those things and how they survived and how they live their lives, because I think that's important when you're trying to talk in their voice, which is one of the most important things about being a ghostwriter, is to speak with that authority in that person's tone of voice, so it feels authentic to readers. So yeah, you get immersed in these other kinds of experiences and other existences, and it is fascinating to find out so many things about ways of life and professions and undertakings that I've never had any knowledge of before. So it's yes, it really is. It is such a varied, eclectic mix of things.
Now, as you've intimated, you've worked on various biographies of quite famous people, or people we would certainly recognize if you told us about them. How do you feel when you are ghostwriting a biography of a famous person or well-known person, and they are talking rubbish?
Ooh,
They're making up stories. It's their truth. It's not the truth. Like Prince Harry's affair.
Yeah.
There were so many factual errors that were picked up so quickly. I mean, how do you deal with a subject who, by the very nature of their celebrity, has probably got a huge big ego and doesn't like being told what to do, and then you say, whoa, what you're telling me is just so not right because it's historically incorrect. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's certainly very sensitive. You're right. There are, I suppose, a couple of things. I mean, you depending on the way you phrase some of what's said, because obviously you're rarely doing a verbatim transcript of the conversations you've had, because that just doesn't work. So you can phrase it in a way that suggests that, from my perspective or through that person's lens, this was their take on it, and that's fine. You can certainly do that. Another thing is, it's sometimes incumbent on a ghostwriter to push a little bit, because obviously you're there to serve the client and tell their story in the way they want to. But if they are coming out with outright falsehoods, or coming out with something that might be defamatory, or approaching a sensitivity, then you can push a little bit and suggest that there might be another way of tackling that part of the story. And there are some difficult conversations we had. And of course, the more you work with your ghostwriter, the more you're able to build up that rapport and that trust. And invariably, people will trust your instincts, because they understand that although you haven't lived their life, you have written books about so many other people's lives that you're able to do it in a way that works. And I suppose, above all else, especially with people who are looking to be published, some of the people I work with self-published and some are published. But if you're getting published, they will respect your understanding of how that process works, and they'll take it on trust that you can make their book more accessible. And you're thinking always about the reader. So if we are saying things which are just going to irritate a reader because they know they're not true, or they're going to stick out like a sore thumb, then it is going to interrupt the flow of the reading experience. It is going to take away from the verisimilitude of the thing. So all of these things are very sort of practical, rational things you can say to your client to sort of steer them around to saying something in a different way.
Have you ever, talk about darling Prince Harry, have you ever refused a client or called a halt when you're going, with Harry? If I was a ghostwriter and Prince Harry was coming out with this stuff for spare, I think ethically I would have had to say, well, I can't do this. I
So
can't
he
write
did.
this book.
The ghostwriter of Spare did. He walked off halfway through. He did.
Have you ever done that? If someone's read it like such a lot of twaddle, and you think, I can't put my name. I don't want my name anywhere near this.
Yes, only once to date, and that was very, very early stages with a client, and I just didn't think we were a very good fit, and their take on life and mine did not match. But it's interesting because I do keep telling people that having part of the joy and the difficulty of being a ghostwriter, I think, is that you are going to work with so many different kinds of people. And by the law of averages, you're not going to find a great rapport with all of them outside of work. You can develop an excellent working relationship, but these might be people with whom you have nothing else in common, no sort of political similarities or attitudes to life, maybe completely at variance. But you can normally still work with them. Because I think one of the jobs of the ghostwriter is articulating lots of different perspectives on life in a way, and you won't be able to agree with all of them, and your readers might not necessarily agree with all of them, but it's good to give people a platform, provided the message, the agenda they're articulating is not an unsavory one. It's good to be able to articulate that for them in a good way so people can read it, draw their own conclusions, and make decisions based on what they've read. So I think that probably sums it up. It's a difficult balance, but you try and go about this as sensitively as you can.
Now, you have obviously had a career that started off as a copywriter and then as a features writer, whatever. We have a number of copywriters in our private creatives group. And copywriters have become so prolific now since the advent of social media, because they take on corporate clients, private clients, and they write their copy and they put their stuff up. And it's quite a growing career. So what kind of tips would you give copywriters or people who are copywriters today who would like to go into the ghostwriting business like you did?
I would say, obviously, one of the first things is to look at autobiographies and memoirs and life stories and learn what you can from them. And I'm not going to give any specific examples, just look at people that you admire, you're interested in, and see how they've written their own stories, or rather how the ghostwriter has written their story for them. And you'll soon pick up lots of stylistic tips from how they do that, in terms of the structure they use, in terms of the way they make the narrative work, and the various devices they employ. But the other, as well as looking at autobiographies and memoirs, look at people's life stories in other media as well. I mean, just fiction is just even as non-fiction writers, we use a lot of fictional devices to make stories sing and leap off the page. So whether that's from books or TV or films or whatever it might be, and look at characters' journeys and how they're presented, because you can learn so much from that, I think. I think the second thing would probably be all about listening and interviewing. If there are any interviewers you particularly admire, whether that's in newspapers or television or radio, study the way they extract information from the people they're talking to, and the way they sometimes cajole or coax information, the way they build up trust. And the way they listen to what their interviewees are saying. And as most copywriters will probably have this as a skill anyway, because it's a very important part of the job. But I think one of the first things I learned years and years and years ago was it's not about being a good writer. It's part and parcel of it, but you need to be such a good listener, because it's easy to go in with a series of prepared questions based on who you think the person is and what you want to know. And very often the little nuggets of information which they sort of casually toss into an answer is where you need to be going. So you need to be able to hear that and come back to it later. So that's probably something that we all need to work on developing, I think. And the third one won't really surprise anyone, and it's all about building a portfolio. But it's very difficult. How do you build a portfolio if you haven't got a portfolio to start with? Is the age-old thing. But any writing that you've done is good. But if you really want to work on memoirs and biographies, find someone, even if it's someone in your family, find someone who really wants to tell their story and help them tell it. Or work with a ghostwriter locally, see if you can do some ghosting of a ghost, and do some work for them to help them. Just get something in your portfolio that you can show to people. I've written this, and then the more you have, the more variety you've got then to show people, I've written in this tone of voice and this tone of voice, and the more the merrier, and that will help.
Wonderful. Very, very good tips there. And I guess the other one would be just keep writing. You've come a long way from sewage, haven't you, Christopher?
I hope so. I think the stench of sewage is forever there, but it's forever there.
Okay, Christopher, we are now at that time of the show where we are going to dig into your psyche. You spend your life in other people's heads. We're about to delve into yours. I'm going to hold up my lovely cards and run my finger along them. So pick a card. Stop.
Lovely pointy one on the corner, yeah.
Okie dokie. Let's see what you picked. Oh, quite apt for what we've been talking about. You picked courage. So, as we're creatives, we're going to ask you about the value of courage creatively. So, what does courage mean to you? What does it look, feel, and sound like?
Right. Okay. What does it mean to me? It means, well, professionally, it means asking the questions that are difficult to ask and suggesting different ways of doing things, which the client doesn't necessarily want for the overall good of the book. That would be a ghostwriter's courage. I'm visualizing it as a suit of shiny tin foil for some reason. That's the first thing that came into my head, so I'm going to go with that. What does it sound like? It sounds like rushing water. And what was the other one? Sorry?
Feel like.
What does it feel like? Oh, it feels like you've had about a dozen bowls of Ready Breck.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I love that. I love that. I remember that advert. Do you remember that with the outline?
The glow, yes.
The glow.
The rosy glow of courage.
Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Lovely meeting you, and we hope you'll come on the couch again someday, and we'll certainly see you more in creative.
Yes.
And, we just wish you all the best in obviously your future projects, and those you can talk about and those you can't.
Thank you both very much. It's been a lovely experience and very nice to talk about some of the things I do. Thank you.